Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Brandon Ricketts, and I am one of the executive board members with the Saskatchewan Caribbean Canadian Association. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to lead the SCCA's first virtual panel discussion called Real Chat Island Style. The panel will consist of 5 Black community leaders, all living within the province of Saskatchewan, who will share their experiences and their insight into handling racism within the workplace, the schools, and also within the general community. Given the recent and current events developing around racism within North America, it is essential that we engage in insightful, transparent, and honest dialogue on what racism looks like and how we can address it appropriately and promptly. So before we begin our discussion, let's get to know our panelists a little bit. Our first panelist is from the island of Barbados and has been living in Saskatchewan for approximately 3.5 years. He is an established technical analyst and a Microsoft certified professional, specializing in managed services within Saskatoon's IT industry. Please welcome Stephen Crichlow. Our next panelist is from the country of Belize and has made Canada a second home for many years, residing in Saskatchewan for the past 15 years. Holding her bachelor's degree in nursing and a master's in science, and completing international training within the field of nursing. She now serves as a clinical nurse specialist and a registered nurse. Please welcome Sheena Gillian. Our next panelist is of mixed heritage. Born and raised in Regina, Saskatchewan, with a strong heritage and ethnicity to Trinidad and Tobago. This panelist was a long-standing member with the SCCA, serving in a leadership capacity with the SCCA's Carib Steel Orchestra and Carrie Sask Festival for a combination of 27 years. Currently serving as an insurance broker in Regina, he is the founder of the Pacesetter Steel Orchestra and the West Indian Culture House here in Regina. In addition, he is a member of the advisory committee for the Trinidad and Tobago Honorary Consulate to Saskatchewan. Please welcome Desmond McAllister. Our next panelist is from the island of Jamaica and has called Saskatchewan home for the past 5 years. Holding a bachelor's degree in English and a master's of human resource management, she has experienced a successful professional career within the areas of sales, banking, and management. With a passion for academic and career coaching, she is now serving as an established student advisor with the College of Nursing at the University of Saskatchewan. Please welcome Diana Sharpe. And our last panelist is a gentleman who is well known within the Regina area as a former sessional economics lecturer at the University of Regina and the First Nations University of Canada. Dwight is a former diplomat who has been heavily involved in diplomacy in the field of economics, serving multiple years as Minister Counselor and Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the United States. Currently, Dwight is serving as the Economic Development Coordinator for the City of Estevan, Saskatchewan. And if he isn't occupied enough as it is, he is also the new Democrat Party candidate for East Kingstown in the next general election for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Please welcome Dwight Bramble. So on behalf of the SCCA, I welcome our entire panel to the SCCA's first ever virtual panel discussion called Real Chat Island Style. I know myself, I am very humbled, I am grateful, and I'm very excited to have this opportunity to engage with you all in some insightful dialogue around the topic of racism, which is extremely important right now. And so in advance, I thank you all for your willingness to commit your time and to just share your experiences and insight on what racism looks like, and also how we can address it appropriately and promptly. And so without further ado, let's jump right into our discussion. So to begin, following the recent death of George Floyd, I know that as a Black man, I've never felt so sentimentally tied and impacted to this extent from the passing of a fellow Black person until now. You know, what we saw on May 25th, the world got to witness the life leave a Black man, you know, at the hands of law enforcement. And by no means is this platform an opportunity to undermine or to disrespect the valuable service that law enforcement provides each and every day to the entire world. You know, we respect them and we honor that service. However, what we saw on May 25th were facts. We saw George Floyd die at the hands of law enforcement, of what many term police brutality. And so, to say the least, those actions and that event was deplorable, it was merciless, and it was heart-wrenching. And I know that many people from all races, nationalities, and political and religious affiliations can share the same sentiments that I do, and I'm sure that we all do, of frustration, of sadness, of anger, and of the desire to just see immediate change. And so with that, we've seen a response of widespread protests, you know, take place beginning within North America, and now we've seen the expansion of that throughout the entire globe. And so to begin our discussion, what are your sentiments in response to the widespread protests, both peaceful and non-peaceful, following the death of George Floyd? And can one justify the rioting observed in major US cities, you know, as an activity within those protests? And so, Dwight, let's begin with your thoughts on this one.
Well, thank you, Brendan. Thank you for having me on this panel. I really appreciate it. We all know that what we saw with respect to George Floyd on May 25th is, to say that it was reprehensible is a gross understatement. I remember back in the 1980s, the Rodney King affair. Some of you might be too young to remember that, but if you know your history, you would recall, a similar situation. Rodney King wasn't killed, but there were protests and riots and so on. And now, almost 30-something years later, we have a similar situation, but a bit worse, because a black man lost his life, and there's no question that was because of racism. Clearly, the police officer doesn't have a record of killing anybody else of a different color. So I am led to conclude that it was because of racism. The problem that just exemplifies what's happening in our societies, particularly in the United States. And it's unfortunate that it had to take an incident this extreme to really wake up the consciousness of our society once again. I'm hoping that this would be a permanent turning point with regards to racism and eradicating racism in the United States. I really do. Obviously, the rioting and the looting and so on as part of the protest is totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. There's no reason for that. And I think it waters down the effectiveness of the protest, because then that's a distraction and people start to get the impression that this protest is really not about getting rid of racism. It's more an opportunity for people to do some bad things, and that we have to condemn.
I fully agree, and let me step in here. I think that the violence and the hostility behind the protests and the attacks on the police take away a lot from the discussion, and it not only waters it down, but it puts us in a worse situation where we become the aggressor, and the police are there trying to maintain the peace at the protests while you're protesting against police brutality. I've heard about some articles talking about disbanding the police. I don't think that's a serious suggestion, because what happens if you disband that institution that's supposed to not only protect us, but help us resolve issues? So it carries it to too much of the opposite extreme, and it just makes the situation worse. And you get distracted from the guy died, he lost his life.
Can I jump in now?
Absolutely.
But I have to say I'm neither here nor there when it comes to the rioting. I mean, it's unfortunate that another Black man lost his life at the hands of law enforcement, but it certainly got the world's attention. At this public execution, very reminiscent of the days of lynching. And it just so happens that the timing and the climate was perfect with the pandemic. People have been locked up. Many are unemployed. People are sick. People are dying. a lot of them are Black, and the socioeconomic disparities that exist in the States have become even more apparent now. It's obvious that Black people are dying all around, whether or not it's from the lack of social determinants of health brought on and encouraged by systems that are foundationally racist, or at the hands of men who have exchanged their hoods for badges. So people are angry. People have a right to be angry and outraged. How they express themselves now is another issue. I think, though, that the days of holding hands in kumbaya and we shall overcome are over. It didn't work for my parents' generation. It's not working for our generation, and the younger generation really will be the agents of change. So, like I said, how they go about doing this is an issue. I can't say that they don't have a right. How they express themselves then, in terms of rioting or peaceful protest, is really, I'm not here nor there on that. But I know that big companies have made their millions and billions off the backs of Black people, and that some of those labels have publicly stated that they don't make their apparels for minorities and Black people to wear, and they don't want their products bought by Black and minorities. So, I think we just need to really examine that, look at that as a people, and wonder, well, okay, if they're using this opportunity to get things that they can't afford, that they've never been able to get, or if it's much, just to be destructive. So how is this somehow gaining these material things? Is it linked to how we feel about ourselves and our self-worth? So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks.
I wanted to share. Thank you so much, Brandon, for having me on the line. Oftentimes we shy away from this discussion because it opens up so much wound, or personally for me, and because we want to say the right thing and we want to give the right expressions. And what my sentiments are is that this incident has just been so painful, has just been so gut-wrenching, and it opens up a wound that many of us would have wanted to ignore, or America's ignored for far too long, or the modern world has ignored for far too long. And it shows lots of gaps. It shows lots of gaps in the education system. It shows lots of disparities in terms of how we access resources, health, jobs, the disparities between those who have and those who don't have, the care that's given to those who need mental health. So many disparities were highlighted by this case, and so many things are opening up. What for me is fundamental is the way that we're going to achieve our outcomes. And I'm on the other side of the fence that says, so I'm like with Fitz and others that says, and I don't know what your full perspective is, but just from what I was hearing from them is, there's a role for advocacy, and there's a role for just for us working through the different systems. So what we're trying to change is a long-lasting legal change, long-lasting change to access, long-lasting change to resources, and really just helping to change the systems that underpin this inequity. So once we can target the systems, then we have less of these occurrences. And that looks like just greater access to schools and to funding, greater policing. So I differ in terms of the defunding. So I know some persons were talking about that, but I believe we need better policing and greater policing in some of these tough areas, because there are areas that are having challenges. When I say greater policing, I just mean greater transparency, greater honesty, acting with integrity, and already I acknowledge the work that is being done by the police force. I honor them. I honor them here in Canada. I honor them in America. I honor them in Jamaica. I know we have bad apples, but it's important that law and order is maintained. What happened for me, the first thing I saw was murder. The second thing I saw was police brutality. And then you see the badge that the gentleman wears and the color that he has. But at first, I really just saw murder and brutality. I saw someone who disregarded his office, disregarded his authority, overstepped. And so we have to look at the things that have been institutionalized, and we have to change the way we operate. Mm-hmm. So maybe at the consciousness level, there is not a respect for all humans, and there's not a respect for the Black man. So there are certain privileges that are not afforded to the Black man, it's afforded to someone else. And we have to change that, right? And racism and discrimination doesn't just affect us, it affects so many other groups that have been othered, disparaged, disadvantaged. And I think the time has come and the cry has now been echoed loudly that we really have to begin to change our narrative, change our inclusiveness, change our culture, and then change our systems. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Diana. Des, did you want to chime in?
Well, I just want to make a straight, kind of go for the jugular here. In the United States, current political situation, how can I put it? In Trinidad, there's a saying that when a fish rottens, it rottens from the head. I think that President Trump has, he has really, for lack of a better term, amped up the whole right-wing groups, just pandering basically to voters, to the grassroots voters. And unfortunately, with this, he has really scratched the surface away for these white groups to rise up and become loud again. When they're previously, under previous administrations, they were quiet and kind of in the corner. You might hear a peep here and there from them, but I think the whole Donald Trump presidency has really amped up the whole right-wing groups and not empowered, but cause for people with these racial tendencies to speak out and act on them in a very aggressive and violent way. And unfortunately, violence will be greeted with violence, and it's a natural human instinct. I don't agree with it, but it is a natural reaction. That's just my 2 cents on it.
And that's very appreciated, Des. Thank you for that. I just want to apologize to our viewers for any technical difficulties if there's freezing of the discussion. Don't worry, we'll still allow things to progress, so we thank you for your patience. Again, to all our panelists, we thank you for being very transparent, honest, and open with your sentiments regarding the recent, the current, I should say, protesting and even the rioting. But with that being said, we'll transition into our Q&A session. And so we'll begin with our topic, of course, of handling racism within the workplace, the schools, and in the community. And so I will direct our first question to Dwight and Desmond. And our first question is, what does racism, both explicit and implicit, look like within the workplace? And how can people of color promptly and appropriately address it when experience it? So Desmond, let's begin with you.
Okay, well, implicit racism can be where one is isolated by their fellow workers or management, being overlooked for promotions, concerns and suggestions that aren't being taken seriously. Explicit racism is just that, racial slurs, discussion and jokes about a particular ethnicity, being picked on because of race, etc. My view, and like in my past experiences with racism in the workplace, I tried shrugging it off, but I've noticed that if you don't counteract it immediately, the perpetrators tend to say, okay, well, I got a green card to call this person the N-word or this person the P-word or something, you know?
Yes.
Then it empowers them to go and victimize somebody else. Oh, it's okay to say, if somebody goes and calls somebody else an N-word, oh, Desmond said didn't mind when I called him that, or when I use that word in front of him. So you have to address it promptly and with both the person who did it as well as management. Because, as I said, one thing could lead to another, to another, to another. It becomes a domino effect. That's my take on it in my experience.
Thanks, Des. Dwight, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just to follow on Desmond, the definitions or interpretations of explicit and implicit racism are very clear. I mean, Desmond already gives some examples, so I wouldn't go into those. But in terms of how can people of color promptly and appropriately address it in the workplace? I think information and knowledge is key right here. First of all, a lot of the racism coming from or perpetrated on Black people is because of ignorance in many instances. And, the workplace is no different. I think as people of color, we need to make sure that we know our rights. We know the rights of workers. Get familiar with regulations, labor laws, these kinds of things, know the work culture of your place of employment. Understand, the nuances of how you behave. If, for example, that your manager or your supervisor is a stickler for you being on time, then be on time. Don't give them a reason to treat you differently under the guise of you not adhering to the work rules and things like that. And talk, communicate, document. If you're somewhere with one person, your manager or whatever, document. We have all kinds of technology now. Put your phone on, record something if you're not comfortable with the situation. And make sure that you cover yourself, because this is a reality that's not going to go away so easily. And the challenge is that, in my view, as I said earlier, a lot of it has to do with ignorance, and oftentimes the perpetrators of racism don't even realize and understand what they're doing. So those would be my recommendations in terms of how people of color react, and handle racism in the workplace.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We will move on to our next question, and I will direct it to Diana and also to Dwight. And the question is, what should employers be doing to create a more inclusive workplace and work environment for people of color? And so, Diana, let's begin with your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Brandon. All right, what's going to be important is the overall framework must support equity. So from the very hiring, so it's going to have to start. So I guess what underpins the framework is that the culture of the organization, which Dwight hinted at. So it has taken us some time, but I believe we have gotten a very far way in terms of promoting diversity and equity, but are we living it? So sometimes we say it, but we don't live it. So the culture may say one thing, but sometimes the practices, the procedures, and the systems say something else. So we have to make cultural shifts, structural changes, and hiring and human resource changes. So your resource must reflect your policies. So it's going to start from everything from hiring to your training, your onboarding, how you make people feel welcome and a part of your organization. And I think the previous person, Desmond, spoke to it, transparency in promotions. So we're talking about social justice for everyone. So we're talking about there should be equity across genders, across race, across ethnicity. So it should look equal. People should get equal opportunity, equal access in the workplace to training, to promotions, and just overall in the planning, everyone should be considered. So for me, it looks like a cultural shift that's open, that's cooperative, that's tolerant, that is respectful, that promotes diversity and equity. And then it looks at the policies and the procedures that must support this. Your hiring must support it, your training, your onboarding, and creating an environment where people feel they have a voice and they have a way to report incidences. So that's another big piece of the legislation, creating legislation that protects people who speak up. Mm-hmm. So when you communicate and when you share, that shouldn't be held against you. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's important. And I just believe that once we start there, then we're moving in the right direction, just to show people the right kind of respect that they deserve and the kind of equity that's needed across the board.
That's good. Thank you, Diana. Fitz?
Yeah, I mean, Diana made some very, very salient points and right on the ball. You know, she hit the target. I just want to add a little bit as well. In Canada here, I think Canada is a if you want to say an immigrant society. Everybody in Canada comes from somewhere. So I think we ought to be more sensitive and knowledgeable about cultures, different practices, different norms, and so on. As an employer, you have to know the laws and the regulations as well. You have to educate yourself, communicate. I mean, if there's somebody from a different culture or different color working in your establishment, take the time out to get to know that person beyond the rudimentaries of what's expected in the work in a normal work day. Include people of color, include everybody in all the activities of the organization. And more importantly for me, the employer must lead by example. The employer has to be firm and stamp out any forms of racism. Right. And I think if the employer can adopt that attitude, that to me would send a strong signal to other workers in the organization that, look, this is totally unacceptable. If you lead by example, that's a big step in the right direction, I think. Yeah. But I think we really need, as employers, the employers need to sensitize themselves to different cultures, people of different color, understand our history, and understand that Black lives do matter. Because all throughout our history, we have been treated as though Black lives don't matter. So the employers have to make sure that they understand all of these very important elements toward, to effectively communicating and coexisting in the workplace.
Very well said, both of you, very well said. And so we'll now shift the focus to handling racism within the community. So this question will be directed to Sheena, Stephen, and Diana. And the question is, how have you observed or experienced racism within your community, and how did you address it? Sheena, we'll begin with you.
So thanks for the question, Brendan. My experience and my observation in Regina is that the Black community is very fragmented, meaning we've got our Africans over there, our Afro-Caribbeans here, our Afro-Canadians, we've got minorities, other people of African heritage in another corner, and we don't really mingle, we don't really come together as a larger Black community to celebrate this commonality and to share. An example of this is I've been in a room before where I'm one of two Black people, and if I don't reach out, if I don't greet or smile, there's absolutely no acknowledgement from between that person and I that we share something. So inter-race prejudice and ethnocentrism is very much alive and kicking in Regina from what I've observed. And oftentimes we think of racism as a social phenomenon that takes place or that happens to Black people. But what we fail to realize is that a lot of times it also happens through Black people in various communities and in various settings. So I think that the answer to that question is much more complex and much larger, bigger conversation than the time I'm allotted here. But acknowledging that it exists, I think, is the first step. So don't get me wrong. Being proud of your heritage, being proud of where you come from is a beautiful thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's when you see others as not pure African because of their backgrounds, then that's what continues to perpetuate this attitude. We know we're all sons and daughters of Africa, like Nelson Mandela said. No matter where we came from, we're Black. We came from Africa. And we're familiar with the quote from Malcolm X about you can't hate the roots of the tree without end up hating the tree. And I'll say then that you can't, those branches of the tree is really what makes a tree, and that those branches and leaves is what makes the tree beautiful. So as Black people, we really need, our diversity is something to be celebrated, and we can start by acknowledging our common heritage, planning events that include all people of African descent, learning about our histories, what common history that we share is colonialism. So we can come to terms of what colonialism did to us, how it's affected us, how it's taught us self-hate, how it's divided us as a Black race, until we accept that, and until we accept that inter-race prejudice does happen, Black on Black racism occurs, we'll continue then to experience this. So I'll say that if we are saying that we are anti-racist, then we really have to stop, and we have to look within our own race and start by cleaning up our own house.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sheena. Stephen, what are your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. She speaks directly to my second example, where I was in Dominica on a personal trip, and I'm from Barbados, so we were traveling around town as tourists, and I went to the cruise terminal, and there's an ice cream stand selling Häagen-Dazs, and me and my brother stand there, and we're talking to the guy, asking for ice cream, but he like blatantly ignores us to the point where he just doesn't respond. Tourists come up, he serves them. I try to justify it and say to myself, okay, this is just him. He's in the tourist industry. He's told not to sell to locals. But the disrespect of not even acknowledging us, it shows, as she was saying, a deeper root of Black on Black racism and also class racism, because that seems to be deeply embedded into this. The not just self-hate, but belief that we are either less, we are poorer, we are less capable, and it just sort of pulls us down. In terms of my other example was more, it's tied to Canada. I was sitting on a bus and traveling to home after work. And the first time it happened, I noticed there was water on the window, but it wasn't raining. So I was like, okay, I sort of ignored it. Next time I passed the same house, a little kid, like 12 years old, he actually spit on the window. So I'm sitting in the bus, I'm a Black man, an adult, sitting in the bus, and a kid spits on the window. And I didn't do anything about it because I'm asking myself, what can you actually do? I mean, it's a racist, it's hatred, it's disrespectful. You're not just spitting at adults, you're spitting at somebody that looks different. And there's so much, you try to bury it and ignore it, but then you bury the disrespect, you bury the pain, you bury the dysfunction within society. And it's so difficult to fight against that it's too complex of a topic to ever say racism will be gone. Because then I look at, when I'm walking around town and I look at First Nations, I find myself being racist because I'm saying gang member or poor, and it's so instinctive that you begin to realize back home, I was Black and we all look the same. So you don't really see racism in the purest sense. I move into a different community, I'm the minority, but I'm still looking at a third minority, First Nations, and judging them. So it's so deep, so personal, that you begin to say sometimes we're being hypocrites. And then we don't take any action. So we're even more hypocrites and putting ourselves down. Yeah, so it's too complex of a topic to give a final answer, but yeah, it's all internal. We really have to look at ourselves and say, we are just as racist as the others, but then we also painting ourselves as the victims. We have a lot of strength to fix this. So that's my thought.
Well said, Stephen. Thank you for sharing those experiences. And
thanks for having me.
Diana, what did you think about this?
So your question was, have I observed or experienced racism in the community, and how can we handle it?
Yes.
And how can we deal with it? For me personally, I have not experienced it since coming to Canada. I've witnessed it in America. I haven't really been a victim of it, but I've witnessed it. But in Canada, I've not. I lived in a small town in Moose Jaw, and you would think you would see lots of it, but we didn't. We were welcomed, we were treated well. Since living in Regina, just based on my circles, I have like two main circles, work and church. I have not really been exposed to it or witnessed it for myself. But where I've seen the discrimination by race is against or Indigenous people. So that has been my greatest concern since coming to Canada. And I do know that Blacks also suffer that in terms of when, they go for benefits or they take the bus. But I haven't observed it. I haven't seen it. But I've observed people of First Nations not being treated as well. In my job, I get an opportunity to hear some of that and see some of that. So for me, we have a greater role to play in terms of advocating for all people. I think each of us individually have a role to play in terms of the way we treat each other. So like I've had some very good experiences. Honestly, no matter what color you are, if I need something done, I'm going to stop you and ask you to do it. Can you take down a toilet paper? Can you hook my dress? And I've done this to random strangers who are Caucasians, who are Indigenous, East Indian, because that's just my personality. So sometimes, as Fitz said, it's about peeling away the layers of the I don't know, the fear of what I don't know, and ignorance. And sometimes what we call racism is really not racism, it's really stereotyping. Because I've said to people that I'm scared of young men whose pants are dropped down, like with ears, fingers, tattoo. Honest I am. Like if I see them at night, no matter what color you are, I've been programmed, and this is just my own family background, that where if the pants is low and if they're raggedy and whatever, then you think, oh, the predator coming to hurt you. Truth is, they're not. These guys are just sometimes young, hip. They're of like a reggae culture, dancehall culture, hip hop culture. You're young. This is their own life to do what they want to do. But the minute I see them not attired in a shirt, pants, buckled, everything, then my instinct says something else. And so I'm not racially discriminating against them, but I'm stereotyping them according to a class and according to a certain set of behavior that I've come to expect. And so we all have to manage our prejudices, manage our stereotypes, manage the way we view each other, and then work at the different things. I respect what Stephen says, but to fear a group or to be cautious of a group is not the same thing as what we have seen in some of the other systemic racism. So when you go downtown and you see one set of persons, you may feel a little way because you may think they're there asking for money, or you may feel a little scared. But that's a little bit different because you're not hurting that group of people, right? So systemic racism more has to do the way with that systems have oppressed people according to different factors, whether it is race, gender, or whatever. So it's a lot of examination for us to do. And as Stephen says, it's complex, it's painful, it's vulnerable. A lot of times we don't want to expose ourselves because we don't want to expose our emotions. But for me, it really takes a great effort on all of us, even those of us who have been on the receiving end, to speak up and to share and say, I don't know what I would do, but I've been would that even be discriminated against? For example, one scenario I have, and I know this is not a racial thing, this was cultural and this was inappropriate behavior. So I love to sing, and we were living in an apartment, and I was not conscious of the fact that I shouldn't be singing as loudly. And my neighbor was next door, and I'm always singing, hence why I'm hoarse today. And so the gentleman came and he beat on the door, and he was very aggressive and, very angry. And he says, you can't do that. You can't do that. And then, said me, shut up your mouth, shut up. And I'm like, but you know what? I was worshiping unto God. So I thought that made it okay. It was not okay. It was not okay. So he spoke to me and then he left. And I felt bad. And then a couple of days afterwards, he called me up and he says, you know what? I'm just an old man that needs my rest. I didn't know who lived over here, but the constant singing disturbs me, wakes me up. So I'd get up like 6 or 7, I'd be making my breakfast. The kitchen would be right there, it would be disturbing him. Is that gentleman racist? Absolutely not. He didn't know who was on the other side of the wall. He just knows that the neighbor wasn't, being as thoughtful or as kind. And so I looked within myself and I thought of that. And for me, I just felt like some behaviors are just not culturally appropriate. And some things that you do maybe back home or some things you normally do, you honor the new cultural space that you're in and you be very respectful. For example, timing. Now, if you're from the Caribbean or if you're from Jamaica, we're not timely people. Well, some of us, most of us. And so if you work anywhere, you may think somebody's picking on you because you're not timely. And the truth is, they're not picking on you. You're not special. They just honor time here. So those are some of the things we have to consider.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you for sharing the experiences. It's good. And so Sheena, you kind of took the question right out of my program here, because you had alluded to, ethnocentrism and, the very controversial issue within the Black community of, division and small forms of superiority versus inferiority. And so you responded to that by alluding to colonialism being, the source of this division within the Black community. But we identify the problem, so we should also address it. So my question to Desmond and to Sheena is, how do we address that divisive behavior? And ultimately, how do we eliminate it so that Black people are supporting the community and setting the example to all races, to all people, of what support looks like? So Des, we'll begin with you on this one.
Well, I can't really speak on the different, how can I put it? I can't really speak on the differences between Caribbean people of African descent and people that are from Africa, like born and raised in Africa. What I can speak on as a person of part East Indian descent is something very parallel that I've experienced with East Indian people looking upon Indo-Trinidadian, Indo-Guyanese, Surinamese, etc., as inferior. I've encountered that a lot growing up. I think some of the main reasons why people, like in my case, and I've observed this in the African community as well, and the Caribbean community, being brought up in the Caribbean community here. One main factor is the loss of language. Those of us who are from the Caribbean, we've lost our ancestral languages. So that main form of communication is kind of gone there, right? Also, there's a perception by a lot of people from the mother countries we could say, that we're descendants of poor, uneducated, unemployed persons, slaves, poor farmers, and in the case of indentured laborers like my ancestors, as runaways or stowaways. People trying to escape the one colonial system to go into another place and face the same things, right? If not worse. Cultural and religious practices have adapted in the Caribbean, and as it would anywhere, to fit the geographical location of where you are, right? Like, for instance, a lot of East Indian culture, and I could speak specifically to Trinidad again, is now something that is what Trinidadian people consider as indigenous culture, which means like it's something that is specifically Trinidadian, because people from India can't understand the way we do things, the way we like our music is different. Even though there's similarities, there's a difference. There's a distinct difference, because being in a multi-ethnic society like Trinidad and Tobago, things bleed into one another, right? So steel band music would mix with Indian music. Soca music, for instance, is originally a blend of East Indian rhythms and African rhythms, or Indo and African rhythms. And I found that, like, to bridge the gap, things like music, cultural events, as well as the evolution of technology, has really started to bring the cultures together. So it's easy to research information. So if I just say, like if I wanted to know something about, let's say, a Vincentian or a Bajan or Jamaican background, right? I could go on Google, look it up, find a YouTube video, and learn information about it, like credible information. Same thing if I want to find out something about India, I could type it in and you'll get credible information to help me have a better understanding of why they think the way they think as well. It's just a matter of taking the first step, and like, you know, like as Sheena said, to reach out, to acknowledge one another, and through discussions and forging relationships, you get to know one another better, right? not only within the Black community per se. When I say Black, I mean people of color, I should say, but with everybody. That dialogue is key to understanding, or learning or understanding. You know what I mean? So yeah, so like yeah, just I've gained a lot of knowledge just from researching and speaking to people. And I think that is an important factor. A lot of people now are buried in their phones and computers without getting to know people, like someone face to face, you know?
Absolutely. Thanks, Des. And you know, Desmond, I hear the drums in the background, so if you feel that there's an opportunity to play some Pan for the people, music soothes the soul. All the power to you.
Afterwards.
Perfect. Again, thanks, Des. And so, Sheena, let's hear from you. What do we feel that the approach is on eliminating, you know, this divisive behavior within the Black community, and as Des had stated, you know, within the communities for people of color, because it seems like it's an issue that is, you know, across the board from one end of the spectrum to the other. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I apologize for jumping your question there, but this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I am quite passionate about it because
Great.
I think that I have experienced more racism and prejudice in Canada as from Black people than I have from white people. And
wow,
honestly, wow. I have one Black friend. That's how hard it is. I've really not ever felt accepted into community, African community, or even the Afro-Caribbean community. I know some island people don't think Belize is Caribbean, but so I get that too, right? In terms of like just coming together, like I had mentioned, that the first step is acknowledging, hey, this does take place, and acknowledging what colonialism did to us. This whole mindset with and it started there, I believe, with us coming. Our ancestors didn't ask to be stolen. They didn't ask to be enslaved and beaten and murdered. And so acknowledging our history and colonialism and what it's done to us and how it continues today, then that is really one of the first steps. And, you know, the Black Lives rallies and the protests that took place in Regina and throughout Saskatchewan was really encouraging. I mean, we saw a diverse group of people, Caucasians and people from African descent from all over the world. So it was really good. I would want to see us coming together as people of color for more positive than reason. So, you know, holding events, educational events during the Black History Month, maybe, you know, having a Black History group, a gathering for Black people, and where we can showcase our different backgrounds and our different heritage, because we have a lot to contribute, I think, to this community, and awareness is one of the keys, and education is one of the keys, breaking down those stereotypes, breaking down those barriers that exist between us. So it'll take a long time to really get there, I believe, but I think that maybe the younger generation, the ones that are born here then in Canada, are beginning to be a little bit more open and accepting to Black races, Black diversity within the Black race. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, I think, in that room.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sheena. Well said. And so we'll now shift the focus to the last aspect of our overall topic, to handling racism within the school environments. And so this question will be directed to Stephen, Dwight, and Diana. And the question is, what advice would you give students on overcoming racism at the elementary, the secondary, and also the post-secondary levels? And so Stephen, let's start with you.
All right, thanks. I think the starting point is to understand what is racism and what is just prejudice behavior. This is tying into Dana's earlier point that sometimes what you see as racism isn't it. It's just a lack of understanding, and Dwight spoke about this earlier. Educate yourself. Also start with yourself and expose yourself to other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in Canada for 3.5 years, and I've heard people say to me, skiing, snowboarding, skating, that's white people stuff. No black person is gonna do that. And it's so stupid and limiting, because then you going to a different culture, going to a different country, going to a different school, and limit yourself to what you think black people should do. And then people see that and say, oh, okay, hockey is our national sport in Canada. Everyone supports hockey, but yet, okay, you're not going to support it. Your actions speak very loud. And if you take the time to go there and expose yourself and show that you can support other cultures, I mean, there's this instinctive reciprocal motion where persons will support you and try to encourage you to interact more and share. Canada is a relatively private culture. Persons sort of stick within their space. And when you're in school, you have a lot more opportunity to expose yourself than afterwards. I mean, I'm an adult, 35 years old, and I can tell you how many friends I have on one hand, probably 2 close friends. When you're in school, you have so much exposure. So spend your time exposing and expressing yourself to people. If you experience explicit racism and you don't know how to deal with it, speak to someone of authority. You don't always want to just escalate and be hostile with it, but you want to appreciate that if you don't understand how to deal with it, and the other person is also ignorant, speak to someone who's knowledgeable, or someone who at least you trust, who can help you work through it, because it just poisons your soul if you hold on to it, become resentful, and just be hateful with the whole situation. We are in a country of immigrants, and we do have a diverse culture, and we have a government and a public that's very open, very respectful, but racism exists. It exists in your mind, it exists in other people's mind, and everyone wants their own. This is my culture, this is my space, give us respect. Give others respect, expect respect in return. And you may not fix the issue, but you can at least help resolve the issue. And it's all about your own mindset and then trying to encourage others. Yeah, so that's my opinion.
Great, good stuff, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks.
Fitz, what are your thoughts?
You're muted. You're muted, Fitz.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying, Sheena, just before I answer that question, you know, St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Belize have a very, very special historical bond. For those of you who don't know that the indigenous people in that part of the world, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, the Garifunas were exiled from St. Vincent and settled on Rattan Island and then settled in those Central American countries. So Sheena and I have a special bond, Sheena. Don't worry, we appreciate you as being part of the Caribbean as well. But yeah, Stephen, again, you know, you highlighted a very pertinent point. The stereotypes that even we as Black people impose on ourselves. I think part of it has to do with our environment and the fact that we get so caught up in this new culture, so to speak, that we embrace when we migrate. Let's say, for example, as first generation immigrants. But certainly, you know, with our children, particularly in the elementary school, we have to constantly talk and communicate and have conversations with our young children to let them know that you weren't made to fit in, you were made to stand out. So if you're the only black kid in your class, that is an honor. You know, that's the kind of conversation I used to have with my young boy when he first moved to Canada. I mean, he wasn't in elementary school. He moved to Canada and started high school. But I've always had that conversation with him, you know, and at the elementary level, I think we also need to constantly be engaged and involved with school activities, communicate with the teachers, you know, monitor what's happening in the classroom, because as a young kid in a young child in elementary school, there are limitations with regards to, you know, what they may be able to observe and detect. So we as parents have to be very close with our young children in elementary schools and just be involved. Just be involved and talk, communicate. That's so key. At the secondary school level, I mean, you know, our children are a bit more mature, and that's where we can encourage them to build friendships with children or with their peers, regardless of color, regardless of culture, regardless of place of birth, you know, and help them to understand that they should be proud of who they are at the secondary school level, and then post-secondary in university. And I remember when I was in university in Virginia back in the 80s, you know, back in the 80s, the incidence of racism was like really blatant and so out there, you know, in a southern state like Virginia. And I had my own experiences back then. You know, I was one of 2 black guys on the university soccer team. And I always used the opportunity to really perform at my best, to show them, one, that a black man can be outstanding, and secondly, to represent my country. I always, whatever I did, I always tried to ensure that I would make my country proud. I also was the founding president of our Caribbean Students Association at my university. So at that level, you can do things. You can be proactive. You can take the initiative to, you know, promote your culture, promote blackness without offending anybody, you know, and just using yourself and what you do as examples to educate and to sensitize and to encourage people of other races to appreciate and understand the black race much better.
Thank you very much, Fitz. And Diana, what are your thoughts on this one?
Beautifully said, Stephen and Fitz. Fitz, you're reading all of my notes. Every single point. Brilliant. And before I come in, I just want to commend Sheena for her perspective. What she said was beautifully said. It runs across culture, education, everything. If we could only integrate more, and that's part of my answer. It's really about integration at all different levels. So I really want to commend her for the response she gave to the earlier question. I really thought that was very good. As it relates to schools, elementary, high school, and tertiary and postgrad, as Fitz says, the approach may look different at each level, but the partnership that's required remains the same. So like parents have a role to play, teachers have a role to play, school administrators have a role to play, governments have a role to play in creating the kind of environment that allows each student to thrive and to feel safe. We want to create safe environments where students can learn and they can come and be themselves and they can just be nurtured. So especially at the elementary level, what we call the primary school level, it's going to be important to teach them the values that, you know, they're precious, they're worthwhile, they're brilliant, they're smart, just like what. So that's why I was laughing when Fitz says that, because you want to teach your young boys and girls that they have a valuable contribution to make. And it's an honor to stand out. And rather than be the exception, be the exceptional one. So rather than be an exception and stand out in a negative way, be exceptional in whatever you do. So at the primary level, I find that we have to advocate more for our children. So we have to be the voice. Because one of the actions you take in terms of stemming racism is observe and intervening and taking action at the primary school level. It's not easy for the child to stand up for themselves and to even identify. They just know they feel bad. So someone on the bus is treating them bad. Someone on the bus is using a funny word that they don't know the meaning of. So when they come to you, you're going to have to clarify that for them and say, it's not a nice word, but it doesn't accurately describe you. That's not who you are. That's not the way mom and dad sees you. It doesn't represent your accomplishments. It doesn't represent your potential, but I'm just going to speak about it and then address it at the, go to the bus driver. Tell him this is happening on your bus. It's happening under your watch. How can you deal with it? Ask the bus driver to speak to the parent or make some connection with you and the parent. If it's happening within the school, teachers have a responsibility to observe and intervene, to document and to address with all parties, and to be that voice for the child who can't stand up for themselves. As the student gets older, we'd have hoped that we'd have done enough to create a clear message of behaviors that are not acceptable, words that are not appropriate, words that are hurtful. So at the high school level, what we want to do is positive reinforcement. We want to encourage our children. We want to encourage students in the class. And Fitz said something very powerful. I think if more persons were involved from all groups coming together, then we wouldn't feel so awkward. So if we saw parents of color in the classroom more, in the school more, then it would make a big difference. But if you go and you look at the parents who are dropping off the cupcakes, dropping off the lemonade, volunteering, sometimes we're not there, and that's because of systemic issues. So we're in lower paid jobs, so we can't steal away from McDonald's. So I'm not knocking that person who's in a lower paying job who can't get away, or that parent who's maybe driving a bus or working in a retail store. So we don't have all equal opportunities. Well, we have to create them. We have to create avenues where we can make ourselves be seen, and we can be advocates, and we can be a part of the change that we want. We can give back, we can speak up, because if somebody sees a Fitz come into a school and speak, it's going to be the same as if anybody else of color anybody of another race, because he just has so much to contribute. So we just have to expose people to different things, to Black excellence, to Black literature, to Black economics. Desmond said it, we have to research more. We have to understand people. Stephen said it. And yes, now that I think about it, I've seen racism against even other people. There are people who don't love Africans for whatever reason, and they say disparaging things about Africans. People who say different things about other groups from, Asia and that part of the world. And we have to be mindful and respectful, and we have to look at people as just people and work with them. So as I said, he shared most of my points. We have to talk about cultural inclusiveness. We have to promote integration. And I had also celebrate your culture. Once people begin to see the value in their own culture and their value in themselves, they'll want to share this with other people. Take action and follow up. We will not effect change unless we begin to take action. And I think that's what some of the persons in America was trying to accomplish. They've gone past the point of talking and they want to take action, but we want to take the right, appropriate action. And those are my thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Diana. And the three of you had all made statements alluding to educating yourself, educating the children, educating people at all levels of education. And so this is a great segue into our last question, which I initially was directing to Dwight and to Desmond, but what I will do is I'd like to open it up to everyone. And the question is there a need to update the current education curriculum to incorporate Black history and perhaps history from other ethnicities and culture? And so do we need to amend the current education system and update it to be consistent with, one, the diversity that we see in Canada today, which is an asset for Canada? And so I will open up that question up to you, Des, first, then we'll go to Fitz, and then if the other panelists want to share their input, please do so. Des?
Yeah, well, I absolutely believe that there's a need to update the current curriculum to include Black history primarily, and history of other ethnicities. But it's easy to, how can I put it? You have to kind of look and educate society as well, in terms of, because most history we get, quite frankly, is Eurocentric, settler-centric history, right? In regards to Caribbean and Black history and so on, there is some literature, but there's not much. A lot of our traditions are oral, so it's through our music, like calypso, reggae, dub poetry, things like that. Like, for instance, I was having a discussion with a good friend of mine, and we said, don't you realize that Calypso has documented our people's history for many, many years. So if you want to find out what happened in 1945, you could find a record or whatever, and they will sing about that specific topic and go in depth with it, right? There's also, I think that apart from that, for Black History Month, I find that for a long time we've kind of got stuck in our rut in terms of who we celebrate for Black History Month. Yes, we celebrate Bob Marley, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, etc. But there's a lot of other prominent Black people that could be celebrated. Like you have people like Dr. Eric Williams, Stokely Carmichael, Geddes Granger, let's see, Maurice Bishop, C.L.R. James, Brian Lara,
Derek Walcott,
and other people that have made huge contributions to Black and Caribbean culture and to the world, really. So I think that those are like, but we have to, if we're going to introduce Black history Black history into the curriculum, it has to be from the Black man's perspective, quite frankly, because only we could tell our story as we would like it to be told. I wouldn't ask somebody who is not of my culture to teach my children about, or to dictate a lesson on my culture. Like, you know, it may sound a little kind of rough around the edges how I'm saying it, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to get at. It has to be like we have to be actively involved in creating this curriculum to be put out, is what I'm trying to say.
Very well said. Thanks, Des. Fitz?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I remember, well, first of all, I think we have to accept that, kind of to follow on what Desmond is saying, history in the schools in the Caribbean leaves a lot to be desired, the subject of history. Absolutely. I remember when I was as a student through primary school and secondary school back in St. Vincent, my history course, my history subject basically was focused on chronicling slavery up until emancipation, and then it seems like life just ended there. And I'm like, I mean, I'm recognizing that now in retrospect, but at the time, at that time, I really didn't realize and recognize, you know, what was going on. And it's sad because, as Desmond said again, there's so much more to our history. I mean, and he named just a few. And I think we need to not just recognize them as part of our history, but recognize and teach that these distinguished Black Caribbean West Indians made and shaped our history. You understand where I'm coming from? So I don't know. I think it's getting a little bit better now in terms of the literature and available publications and so on with regards to Black history and Caribbean and West Indian history. But much more needs to be done, and I agree. I mean, in Canada and in every country, I believe that Black history should be a part of the curriculum. I mean, why should we? Who determines that the curriculum should emphasize European and other types of history and not Black history? Who makes that determination? You know, and I think we as Black people, we as a Caribbean community, we should and could start to advocate for that kind of stuff. Let's get ourselves on some of the school boards. You know, let's get ourselves in some of the ministries of education. Let's get ourselves on some city councils and start to effectuate those kinds of changes. You know?
Well, when you're talking about history being taught in the Caribbean schools, I have had lots of discussions at length in regards to that. For instance, I when I was visiting Trinidad this last time, I asked some of my nieces and nephews and cousins, if they knew anything about the 1970 Black Power Revolution in Trinidad. They looked at me like they didn't, like, what's going on? There's a black country and you're asking me about this? You tell me that there's a Black Power Revolution in 1970. Weren't we independent in 1962? And then they did research and found out about it. A lot of them didn't know about the attempted coup d'etat in Trinidad in 1990.
Yeah.
Kids nowadays don't know anything about it because it's not being taught in the curriculum. The curriculum is still very colonial in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it's basically to learn to regurgitate rather than to actually learn and understand yourself. You know, you know everything about America, Europe, and Canada, but what do you know about your own neighborhood?
Yeah.
What do you know about the Great Indian Revolution? Can you speak about the unrest in the 1970s in Jamaica?
Yeah.
These are things that should be taught by Caribbean people, and Caribbean people, in order for us to educate others, we have to learn ourselves about these things.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have to say
Good point. Yeah.
ignorance in some of my own history and our history, but I'm glad to know that there's a petition going around to address the whole
Curriculum change and calling for more history, Black history, to be in the schools right now. So, and I'll say, I mean, from what, if I can recall learning about anything about Black history, it's mostly focused on slavery and, like Desmond said, a more colonial perspective. But I think what we really need to be doing is starting to talk about let's teach about the Mansa Musas. Let's teach about the Ethiopian empires and the great Mali empires of past. Let's talk about Black Wall Street and the great things that Black people are capable of and that have done, that can really squash some of the ideas of that we ourselves have mentally enslaved ourselves, really, and limited ourselves in what we are capable of doing, and really bring that out more, and little less focus on the negative side. And I think by continuing to teach that, oh, we were slaves, oh, we're oppressed, that in a subconscious way, it actually becomes part of who we are, and teaches us that, you know what, we were oppressed, we're going to continue to be oppressed. This is what our ancestors went through. So a little bit more focus I'd like to see on the positive aspects and the great kings and queens that we descended from as African people.
Exceptionally said, Sheena.
I think that's fantastic, because I've been thinking, since I've been doing Indigenous training, Caribbean First Nations training at work, the storyline is a bit more of getting more information about what the history is in a positive way. And this conversation strangely reinforces that. I'm also thinking, instead of teaching ancient Black history, try to create and teach modern Black history. There's so much that happened between independence and today that we don't fully understand. And when I was a student, history was so dry and boring. Dusty old books that you got from the school library that went through 15, 20 different students, never revised. I never cared about history. So how are you going to get today's students whose attention span is so short to care about history? You got to teach something that's relevant to today. And when Fitz said that he teaches his son, if you're the only Black person in class, you should be proud of this. That spoke to me, because I was talking about understanding others' culture. You got to be proud of your culture and be able to present it. And to do that, obviously the curriculum needs to change, but who do you present as strong representatives of Black culture? We know that America and Wall Street exists. Who are strong Black leaders within American Wall Street, within American industry, within Canadian industry, and then even more importantly, who are strong Black leaders in Caribbean Caribbean countries? Do we actually know who the leaders are of each Caribbean nation? I know Barbados, but I have no idea who else. So it's we limit ourselves, and Sheena spoke to it. We keep teaching slavery. We were slaves. We were oppressed. The mind is very immediate. It's very immediate. So I'm a slave. I'm an oppressed people. No, I'm not a slave. I'm not an oppressed people. I'm not an oppressed person. If you teach that in school and focus so heavily on the negative history, you're just reinforcing negative, not only in our minds, but the other students that are trying to learn about Black culture. Oh, Black people are oppressed slaves. That almost says service industry. That almost says lesser down. So no, who are our leaders?
Just very good perspective.
Yeah, push. Positive.
Very good perspective, Stephen.
Yeah,
Brandon, I just wanted to share a little bit on that. It's interesting that at the primary level, you don't get a lot of history, but you do get some civics about government. And at the high school level, so I'm different. I loved history. So I did history both at the CXC level and the A levels. And at the CXC level, you do the pre-emancipation and the post-emancipation. One thing he said was true. The books passed through many hands and they were rarely updated or revised. And it really just talks about life on the plantation, life after the plantation, indentureship. And then I don't think it went all the way up. It didn't. And then when we got to A levels, then you had a choice to choose European, American, and West Indian. And I chose West Indian and American because I found those two to be interesting and some students. But the curriculum has always been Eurocentric throughout the Caribbean, and I think possibly maybe even in Canada. In America, though, they have an interesting case study in the way that they have embraced and celebrated Black history. So there's a lot to be modeled from them and the way they have celebrated their Black leaders. What I found interesting was that when I got to the university level, then you see the right literature. So at the university, which is very weird, and all of us are making some fundamental points. Now, what Sheena was saying, we have to go back to her original point about the way we see ourselves, the culture, the disintegration and the disparity even within among Black people, the stories we tell and the narratives that we believe. Because it's so funny, and Stephen, that came up in the US and I think in UK, one of my friends teaches, when you're exposing students to racism by teaching it, and I think they had an example where students were asked to dress up in faces and, you know, reenact these things, and parents said, no, we cannot be reenacting things that have passed and things that are hurtful. Teach the lesson, but no one needs to reenact anything. You can't reenact a plantation, you can't reenact whipping somebody, that's too painful a memory. But it's interesting at the primary school level and the high school level, what we see is the pain and the suffering and the oppression of the Black people. But when I got to university and I did my courses, so we had Pan-Africanism, we had Garveyism. And when you learn about the movement of the UNIA, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, all of the different movements that happened throughout the US and the Caribbean and in Africa, and the way they tried to activate and unify the whole African Union, it was very, very interesting and rich. And I think even here in Canada, there's world history. There's history about Indigenous people, but it's at the university level. History about Asian people and Hindu. So there are lots of Hindu courses. There's Hindu and Hollywood, Hindu and film. So there are different things that you can do. But then you've already told us one thing from you were age 1 to age 18. So now when we get to 18 and we're hearing this, it's foreign to us. And a lot of people don't absorb it and take it on. So being Black then don't mean this nice, powerful thing. So by the time you get to level 3, you're doing your level 300 courses and you're hearing about Garveyism. And we're talking about being Black and power and everything. A lot of people don't absorb it. It's just a course that they're doing for credit. And they're doing it just to pass, as opposed to shaping young minds very, very early. And I agree with Desmond. Give them other things to see. We must commend the efforts of those who have been trying. Like there's another association here from you that I've seen where they celebrated a hairdresser from, I think she was from like Nova Scotia side. She was Canadian, but she was like Afro-Canadian. So there are people, even in Canada, Blacks in Canada, that should be celebrated and should be incorporated in telling the Black man's story and in talking about Afro-Canadian experience and African experience and just the way we incorporate it. And at the primary high school or the elementary high school and secondary level, it's possible. It's possible to talk about all peoples of the land, right? There were some people who were here first, and then there were some who came after, and we continue to build on our society. So what modern society looks like, it's like a nice blend of different cultures. And we do try, and I know schools try. We have our mosaic days and potluck days and different things and dress up days, but more can be done to integrate it at a cultural level and at an educational level.
Thank you very much, Diana, for the input. And so with that, that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion already. And so, you know, on behalf of the SCCA, I want to thank you guys again for your time and for exceeding expectations in terms of this inaugural panel discussion, you know, with a full panel of people of color. And so, again, thank you for the insight. Thank you for sharing your experiences, and thank you for also making calls to action, you know, for all people. You know, I think that people who are going to watch this panel discussion will be challenged to pursue things that are, you know, we use this term change, but do people actually know what the change looks like? You know, what is that change? It's such a broad term. And so I believe that the five of you really help define what that change is and what the next steps and progression can be in achieving that change that we're all talking about. So again, thank you. I just encourage you all to continue to be healthy, to be safe, and just continue being, you know, the great community leaders that you are. It is very much appreciated, especially for the young people who are just trying to rise above, you know, these limitations. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate being here.